So we are starting a new series that's about having a heart after God's own heart. And we will be studying what it is about King David that made God say, he's a man after my own heart. We know that David was not a perfect person. And so that's good news for all of us because we don't have to be perfect either. So this series is based on this Bible study. So this, Be a Person After God's Own Heart, it's a chronological study of David and the Psalms that he wrote. This is a 48-week study. A 48 reading study. You can do it 2 units a week or whatever. Like, it takes about 9 months to do it, but it's a very comprehensive, in-depth study of David and all of the characteristics and things that he did that made him the man after God's own heart. So we're going to pick out some of the gems. We're going to take a speed trip through this study. We're going to do it in 6 weeks. And so I've divided it up into sections of David's life, and we will be looking at one section each of the 6 weeks and look at the characteristics of David, the things that he did that made him the person after God's own heart. And we're also going to look at David's flaws and shortcomings, because every man of God in the Bible, except for Jesus, had flaws and shortcomings, just like we all have flaws and shortcomings. So there's no perfect people, and David wasn't perfect either, but he was the man after God's own heart. So we can all become people after God's own heart, but we have to be purposeful about it, I think. We can't just go through life and not even think about God and expect to have a heart after him. We have to be purposeful about seeking God as our companion. So let's go ahead and we will start at the beginning of David's life in the Bible and look at what it is that makes him after God's own heart. In the beginning of David's life in the Bible, the Lord sent the prophet Samuel to go anoint the next king of Israel. And so in doing that, he sent Samuel to the sons of Jesse. And Samuel went there to anoint the next king. And in 1 Samuel 16:17 says, "The Lord said to Samuel, 'Do not look on his appearance or on his height or stature, because I have rejected him.'" And this is what the Lord said about one of David's older brothers. Samuel was going through all of the older brothers, and the Lord said, "Don't look at him like that." The Lord said, "For the Lord sees not as the man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart." So first and foremost, it's important for us to know that God does not look at us like we tend to look at each other. God looks at what's inside of us as opposed to what things look like on the outside. And David, at that point, was so unkingly, nobody even thought to bring him to Samuel. So Samuel went through all of the older brothers of David, all the sons of Jesse, and God rejected every one of them. And so Samuel was like, "What? Are there no other sons?" And they said, "Oh, well, yeah, there's that kid David out there tending the sheep." And so they had somebody go get David and bring him to Samuel, and God said, "Yes, he's the one, anoint him king." So David was anointed as the next king, even though on the outside, he didn't look kingly to anybody else there. But God knew his heart. He knew what was inside. So the first thing that we see is that God looks at our appearances differently. He does not look at those, he looks at our heart. And so, no matter how much we pretty ourselves up, handsome ourselves up, polish our exteriors, put on a show, make it look like we've got our act together, or whatever it may be, God knows what's really inside. He knows our true motives, our true heart. He knows the darkness. He knows the light that we have within our character. And that's what God looks at. And he knows us intimately because he made us. And I think it's important at this point, too, to notice in 1 Corinthians 2:11, it says, "Nobody knows a man's heart except for God." And so that's part of why it's important for us to also not assume we know each other based on the appearances we see before us. We can't possibly know the deepest character traits of other individuals. Each person here God knows us, and we know each other on the surface, and we know each other at different degrees, but none of us really knows each other's heart at the core. So, as we continue to look at David, the first glimpse of David's actual character comes in the battle with Goliath. And everybody goes, oh, I know this tale. But we're going to look at this tale a little bit differently because it's a story that has a lot about David's character, even as a youngster, that goes well beyond a boy shooting a giant with stones. So we'll pick up the story where David comes into the picture. The men of Israel have been up against the Philistines at a front line, and David was the youngest brother, and he was going back and forth between his father's sheep and the front line of the battle, carrying rations to his 3 older brothers. And so he would come, and he would see this giant, time after time, out there taunting the men of Israel. And so David says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? So here we see that David, first of all, acknowledges it's God's army. It's not Saul's army. It's not just a gathering of men. It is the army of Israel. It is the army of God's people. And they are being taunted by a giant, and everybody's stopped in their tracks and fearful of this big hulk of a guy. So David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. So David shows that he's passionate about defending God's army and defending God's name. He doesn't want anyone taunting his God and his people. So he's willing to step in and defend the holy name of God. David desires to take away what he calls the reproach of Israel. They are being made fun of, and it's not looking good for them. So we see in 1 Samuel 17:33, Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine and fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war since his youth. So we've got this big man of war coming up against this young boy, and on all the outward appearances, everybody's back there laughing. Like even in the Bible, it has some account of David's brothers kind of like, who do you think you are? They are all grown men. They're afraid. They're not doing anything. David says, I'll do it. So David said to Saul at this point, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. When there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. So here we see that David has the utmost confidence in God. He has confidence in the gifts and talents that God has given him. He's used them with certainty before, and David doesn't have any doubts. He's going into this battle ready to fight. And, he was a shepherd and protector of his flock. And later in our series, we will see that David was also a shepherd and a protector of his people, and with confidence with God. So here it's important to know that David defeated both lions and bears, which were formidable enemies. And he did that knowing that God delivered him from those lions and bears. And David had confidence that God would continue to help him in this battle based on his experiences with God. So David's getting ready for battle with Goliath, and Saul decides he's going to outfit David with his armor. And David tried it on, but it didn't fit. So David says to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. He took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand as he approached the Philistine. So here we see that David knows all he needs to go against a giant like Goliath is God. He needs his skills, his slingshot, and some stones. And he doesn't need any metal armor for defense like all of these other men. He's going strictly with the armor of God. And that's described elsewhere in the Bible. But, he's just a bare-skinned youth going up against a giant. And so David is more confident in God's protection than anyone else in Saul's army has been. They are all outfitted with their armor, and they're still afraid to go up against Goliath. So after all of the taunting they've been through, they've shown that none of them had the confidence in God that David did. And David was certain in his heart that God had the power to defeat the giant and that he would do so. So David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. So this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and your dead body of the host of the Philistines this day will be given to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with a sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." So there's no wavering in David's beliefs, none. He's much smaller and younger than Goliath, but he declares he comes in the name of the Lord, and he declares that the battle is not his, but that it's God's. And David gives God credit for the win before he even enters the battle. He is totally focused on God. David is 100% confident in God and focused on God, and in spite of all of the outward appearances. He's not looking at the evidence in front of him. He's looking to God. And so 1 Samuel 17:50 says that David prevailed over the Philistine with a slingshot and the stone, and David struck the Philistine and killed him. And there was no sword in the hand of David. And so this demonstrates that David, as a person after God's own heart, looks to God and not to appearances for what he's going to think about and do about in a situation. And just as God looks beyond our exterior appearances and looks at our hearts for knowing us, if we're going to be a person after God's own heart, then we need to not look at the appearance of our circumstances, but we need to look to God to know that he is the one who saves. He's the one that provides for us in every circumstance. So in this story, we see the evidence of David's faith. We see his willingness to fight for and defend the name of God. And David has the skills and ability that God has given him, that he has full confidence in. He readily uses them to serve God. And, with that, David is a wholehearted follower of God. So through the story, we have learned 5 things about having a heart after God. One of them is that God looks at our hearts and not our appearances. So we need to focus on our hearts, not polishing up what we look like to the world. David defends the name of God passionately and without hesitation. So we can learn from this that, standing up for God in whatever circumstances we encounter matters. And David has complete confidence in God in every way. And that, I think we learn some by experience, by putting our faith in God and seeing him work through our circumstances. David's motives are focused on the world knowing God. He said that he comes so that all the world will know there's a God in Israel, and that all of the assembly would know that God's victory doesn't come with a sword. And lastly, David gives God credit and recognition for all of the achievements that he has in his life. So we kind of come to this point and we have to ask ourselves, how confident are we in God when we're facing our giants? And where is our heart when it comes to having a heart after God? How passionate are we about God? There are a lot of things we can look at internally about ourselves and our relationship with God that are important for defining having a heart after God. So we'll have some self-reflection types of questions. We have some self-reflection to do. And I hope the series ends up being an excellent series for everybody as we go through it, and just building confidence in the fact that we can each be people after God's own heart, even if we aren't perfect people.